Good afternoon, everyone. I would like to thank you for joining us today for the second episode of Conversando with Ruth Behar, a joint series of Casa Cuba and the Jewish Museum of Florida at Florida International University, our FIU. Before we begin, I would like to introduce Casa Cuba for the benefit of those who may be unfamiliar with the project. Casa Cuba is an initiative of FIU to build a leading cultural center and think tank for the discussion and study of Cuban affairs and the celebration of the Cuban heritage. Casa Cuba has secured a prominent site on our FIU campus to build an iconic facility and received significant philanthropic support towards the upcoming design and construction of the center, including prestigious grants from the Knight Foundation and the National Endowment for the Humanities. Our future iconic home will feature galleries for interactive exhibits, classrooms to teach FIU's more than 70 courses on Cuba, and a state-of-the-art venue for events, artistic performances, and dynamic programming such as Conversando. I am always proud to acknowledge that once Cuba is built, FIU will be the only university in the nation with two major institutions devoted to Cuban and Jewish heritage. It is therefore our greatest aspiration that we will become the hub for Cuban Jewish history and culture, and we need your help to make that dream a reality. Conversando is just a taste of what you will experience at Casa Cuba. In this episode of the series, we are honored to be joined once again by the distinguished writer and cultural anthropologist, Ruth Behar, who gives us a privileged first look at her new book, Letters from Cuba, which you can pre-order from Books and Books and other bookstores, but we highly encourage you to consider our local bookstore, Books and Books. Today, Ruth will be in conversation with my esteemed colleague, Susan Gladstone, Director of the Jewish Museum of Florida. I would like to thank Ruth and Susan for their generous collaboration, and thank you also to our friends at the Jewish Museum of Florida and the Casa Cuba team, with a special thanks to Dr. Maite Morales for the coordination of this event and the series at large. I wish you and your families the very best during these challenging times, and I hope to see you at future Casa Cuba and Jewish Museum of Florida events. I hope that you will join us in our historic effort to build our Casa Cuba. Thank you. I will now introduce my colleague, Susan.
Thank you so much. It is our great pleasure as the Jewish Museum of Florida FIU to be able to do this program in conjunction with our friends at Casa Cuba. And for those of you who may not be familiar with the Jewish Museum of Florida FIU, we are located on South Beach in what was the original synagogue, the first synagogue on South Beach, Congregation Beth Jacob. And we very much look forward to the day when we can welcome you into our museum. But in the meantime, we are running a very, very active virtual museum. And I encourage you to please take a look at our website, jmof.fiu.edu, to see all of the wonderful programs such as this that we are participating in or creating out of our museum. Today, it is my great pleasure to welcome Ruth Behar to this conversation. She is an award-winning author of a number of books, including Lucky Broken Girl. She was born in Havana, grew up in New York, and has also lived in Spain and Mexico. She writes largely for young people, but her work also includes poetry and memoirs and acclaimed travel books, such as An Island Called Home and Traveling Heavy, which explore her journeys to Cuba and her search for home. She was the first Latina to win a MacArthur Genius Grant, and other honors included John Simon Guggenheim Fellowship and being named a great immigrant by the Carnegie Corporation. She is an anthropology professor at the University of Michigan, where she lives in Ann Arbor. And it is my pleasure at this point to welcome Ruth Behar.
Thank you so much. It is such an honor to be here today. I'm so grateful for Casa Cuba and the Jewish Museum of Florida for this amazing opportunity to introduce to you, to really give you a preview of my new book, which will be coming out on August 25th, Letters from Cuba. And I want to say first, thank you to Maria Carla for her amazing vision of Casa Cuba, Maite Morales for her incredible work coordinating these events, and Susan Gladstone for directing the Jewish Museum of Florida, which is one of my very favorite places in Miami. So this is just a beautiful, beautiful, beautiful opportunity. I'm so glad to be here. I want to welcome everybody who's come today. I know my family, my parents, mommy, papi are listening, and family and friends, old and new friends. So thanks to all of you for being here today to learn about Letters from Cuba, my new novel. So I have a little slideshow that I'm going to use to give you some background on the book and to tell you a little bit about the inspiration for this book. So here you see the cover of the book, and it's just beautiful artwork by the artist John Parra. And if you look carefully, there's three places being shown in this cover. Up at the top, the left-hand corner, that's Poland, which is a place that my main character Esther is saying goodbye to. Then a little further down in the picture, you see the ship moving towards the port of Havana. You can see the Capitolio there too. And then further down, you see some trees and some land, and that is the town of Agramonte in Matanzas that you'll be learning about a little bit further on as I tell you more about the book. So Letters from Cuba. Let's go to the next slide and I'll tell you a little bit more. So I'm starting with this picture. My parents are probably laughing of my parents' wedding. This is my mother and father marrying in 1956 in Havana, Cuba. And I wanted to start here because I wanted to tell you that I am a child of an intermarriage, or what was thought of as an intermarriage in 1956. My father is Sephardic. His family is Jewish from Turkey, but originally from Spain. Sephardic Jews are the Jews that left Spain in the 15th century rather than convert to Catholicism, which was their other choice. And these Jews fled Spain and ended up in many countries of the Ottoman Empire and many in what is now Turkey. And that's where my father's family was from, and they migrated to Cuba in the 1920s. So that's the Sephardic part, the Behar part. But my mother is Ashkenazi, and she is standing next to her parents and her great-grandparents, and they are Jews from Poland. My grandfather was from Russia, but my mother's mother was Polish, and they also immigrated to Cuba, and they are Ashkenazi Jews who spoke Yiddish, as Ashkenazi Jews do, a form of Old German, we might say, just the way Sephardic Jews speak an old form of Spanish known as Ladino. So they were two very, very different Jewish communities. And my parents in marrying brought together the Ashkenazi and the Sephardic cultures. So I grew up with these two Jewish cultures, plus also being Cuban. Now, in Letters from Cuba, I'm focusing on my grandmother's story, my mother's mother, and she's shown there to the left of my mother. And then it is her story and her relationship with her father, my great-grandfather, at the end with the glasses and the mustache. So let's keep going and show you a few more pictures. So that's me as a little girl in Havana. I was very close to my maternal grandparents, my mother's parents, and you can kind of see that just in the way I'm holding on to the two grandparents and have my little hand around my grandmother's neck. I was very, very close to my grandmother Esther, who all of us, all her grandchildren called Baba. So let's go to the next one. I can tell you a little bit more. So Baba was from the town of Govorovo. This was or is still a town about an hour away, a little bit more an hour from Warsaw. This is where she was from, and she immigrates from Govorovo to Cuba in the late 1920s. Let me show you the next picture. And here is my grandmother in the next slide. Just soon after, a couple of years after arriving in Havana, just to give you an idea. And so she was one of thousands of Jewish immigrants from Poland who went to Cuba in the 20s and 30s, looking for sanctuary and refuge and to start a new life in Cuba. So let me tell you, let's go to the next slide. Let me tell you why Cuba, right? So You probably know that many Jews migrated to the United States in the late 19th, 20th century. In the late 1800s, there was a mass migration, many of them from Russia, fleeing poverty and pogroms, and they came to the United States. And you can see in this cartoon that's racist and anti-Semitic that the cartoonist is suggesting that there are too many of these immigrants, right, by the end of the 19th century. Let's look at the next slide. And so by 1924, the United States passes an immigration act that seeks to limit the number of aliens, so-called, that could come into the United States, right? And they create a quota system. And with this quota system, they limit the numbers of people that can come from particular countries to the United States. So let me show you in the next slide, just to give you an idea. Here are some numbers of the quotas, and you can see that 80%, they wanted them to come from Germany, Britain and Ireland, Scandinavia, and then the other 20% more or less was coming from the rest of Europe, and Poland was only getting 3% of the quota. And if you look further down, Turkey was getting even less. So this is what led so many of these Jewish immigrants to go to Cuba. And Cuba at the time was open. You could immigrate to Cuba from these countries. And so many Jews who might have wanted to come to the United States went to Cuba instead, knowing that Cuba is very close to the United States. They didn't have the internet then, so they didn't have exact information, but they had heard that Cuba was so close that you could practically swim over to the United States. So many said, okay, we'll go to Cuba. Let's look at the next slide. So my grandmother's story is very interesting. She's in the white dress, seated there in the front row. My grandmother, Esther, so she was the first of the children to go to Cuba. She was the eldest. And my great-grandfather had already been in Cuba for a couple of years, had only made enough money to bring one child to Cuba first. And he wanted that child to help him bring the rest of the family to Cuba. And so he wanted to bring one of his sons, particularly his son Moshe, who was second oldest after my grandmother. But my grandmother really wanted to be the first to go to Cuba. She was the eldest, and she wrote to him and she said, even though I'm a girl, I'm going to help you bring the family to Cuba. And she did. And I always heard that story. She always told me that story growing up. And the family was reunited. And when they were all finally in Cuba, they settled in the town of Agramonte in the province of Matanzas. And you can see my great-grandfather there. He's the one who's wearing that, that straw hat. He almost looks like Jose Marti, but he was actually a very religious Orthodox Jew. So let's go to the next one now. So here in this slide, you see my grandparents. My Aunt Sylvia is the older girl, and the little girl is my mother there, Sylvia and Rebecca. They were my grandparents' first two children, and then later my Uncle Mickey was born in Havana. And the family, this little nuclear family, spent several years living in Agramonte because the family eventually scattered and moved on, and they stayed in Agramonte and ran a general store. They were the only Jews in the town, and then later some other Jewish people moved to Agramonte, and so my family was known as los Polacos Viejos, and those who came afterwards were the Polacos Nuevos. That was how they were referred to in Agramonte. Then eventually my grandparents and my mother and aunt moved to Havana, but for several years they were in Agramonte. So I grew up hearing about Agramonte and was very fascinated to know more about this town where my family lived. We'll go to the next. Now, this picture was very interesting. I would see it at my grandparents' house after we left Cuba. We resettled in New York, and then eventually my grandparents retired in Miami Beach. And I would see this picture on the wall, and I finally asked my grandmother, well, who is this? And this was my grandmother's grandmother. And she told me that her grandmother hadn't wanted to leave Poland, and she had stayed behind, and she had died in the Holocaust. And so this grandmother represented the relative that didn't leave, that stayed behind and died in the old country. And I was so moved by that, the idea that my grandmother had been saved by going to Cuba, and she had also helped to save her family, but this grandmother stayed behind and couldn't be saved. We'll go to the next slide. So I decided, after thinking about this whole history and so inspired by all these stories, that I would try to write a novel based on my grandmother's life. It's not a biography, it's a fictional story, but it's inspired by the idea of a young girl, a young woman who wants to be the first to go to Cuba and bring the whole family to safety on the island. And I decided to set it in 1938 on the eve of World War II. Here you can see this lovely floor mosaic in the city of Havana, and we'll keep going. And so Agramonte and that whole region around the city of Matanzas is an amazing region. It was filled with sugar plantations. And here, just to give you a sense of it, and this economy continued into the late 1880s, and the plantation owners brought enslaved Africans to Cuba to work the sugar cane. So that was a very important part of the history of Matanzas that I knew I would have to integrate into my novel. We'll keep going. So here, just to give you some images of what Agramonte was like at the beginning of the 20th century. It was an important municipal town. You can see some of the stores. We'll go to the next slide. You can see what Agramonte looked like, and these stores were very well equipped, as you can see, country stores, just to give you a sense of what this place was like. And this is what I was imagining as I was writing my novel. This young girl, Esther, I make her 12 years old in the novel, and she's ending up in this town, this country town in Cuba, surrounded by sugar fields. Okay, we'll go to the next slide. And I've been to Agramonte several times over the years. These pictures were taken about 2 years ago. And just to give you a sense of what Agramonte looks like today, this was my inspiration for my novel. It's not a novel so much about Agramonte, but it's inspired by this place that exists still today in Cuba. So we'll move a little bit more just to give you a sense of Agramonte today. And next one. And next one, and here you can see Agramonte has a Casa de Abuelos. That looks very nice. We'll go to the next one. And so I did some research in Agramonte and around Agramonte to see what I could learn about these sugar plantations that had existed in the region. And you'll see a little bit more closely, I found out about this tree, which is a sacred tree. We'll go to the next one, you can see better. There's a chain around that tree. And this lady who lives in that area told me that this is a sacred tree, that the chains were chains that held slaves and enslaved Africans in the 19th century. And this chain wraps around the tree, and that offerings are left there in memory of the enslaved Africans who worked the sugar. And Agramonte is also a town that has a very, very important veneration for San Lázaro. And San Lázaro is known as Babaluaye in the African perception. And San Lázaro Babaluaye is a very, very important deity who helps people who are sick, who have ailments of the legs in particular. And so there's a lot of veneration for San Lázaro Babaluaye in Agramonte. And on December 17th, or starting the night before, they have very important rituals for this deity. They have a bembe with dancing, chanting, and bata drumming. And I've gotten to see all of that several times. And here I discovered on my most recent trip to Agramonte that there is a house that has a fountain inside of it, just like a spring water just coming straight out of the ground, and it's supposed to be, a representation of Yemaya. Yemaya is a deity of the ocean, and she's represented in the Catholic pantheon with La Virgen de Regla, the Virgin of Regla. And so I was very, very taken by this, the idea that there is this home shrine for Yemaya in Agramonte, and this also ended up in my novel. So I had a lot to think about on the Cuban side, and we were talking earlier, Maria Carla was talking about the convergence of Jewish and Cuban, and that's what I'm trying to do in this novel. So here's the Cuban part, kind of, we're going through that gate to understand Cuban culture. And now in the next slide, I want to show you that I wanted to also have a convergence with Jewish culture. So you saw this picture earlier of my grandmother, and it's actually a picture on a postcard, and the back of it has a message in Yiddish that she wrote that I don't know how to read because I don't know Yiddish, but I had a translator translate this for me. On the next slide, you'll see what it says. And she's saying, as a bride, I'm sending my picture as an eternal memento to my beloved Tateshi from your loving daughter, Esther Levin. And they also say tatele in Yiddish, and Tateshi is kind of a Polish variant on tatele. So I thought this was so interesting that my grandmother had handwritten this postcard. And I thought, how am I going to tell this story? How am I going to write this novel? And it occurred to me that it would be all in the form of letters that Esther is writing to her sister Malka. This is a fictional character who is in Poland and waiting to get to Cuba. And that Esther will write these letters to let Malka know about her experiences in Cuba while she's waiting for them to be reunited. So I don't really have any letters of my grandmother, but I do have these postcards with messages on them. And then my grandmother, when we came to the United States, she would work in a fabric store throughout the day. I'll never forget that. And then at night, she would take English classes. So I had this representation of her handwriting. And then in the next slide, and I thought, you know, if she writes letters, I would imagine them in this handwriting, but in Yiddish. We'll go to the next slide. And so I started thinking about this, that she's writing these letters in Yiddish, though of course I'm writing them in English, but it's as if she's writing in Yiddish. And we'll come back, we'll read one of the letters later. And so this is what it would look like in Yiddish. And on the next slide, the last one, you'll see what it would look like if it was handwritten. What I wrote in those two paragraphs that you saw earlier, this is what it would look like handwritten in Yiddish. So bringing these two worlds together, this Cuban world in Agramonte on the one hand, and this Jewish world that she's bringing from Poland on the other hand, I wanted to bring those two together in Letters from Cuba. And I wanted to bring into children's literature a character we've never seen before, this Jewish Polish girl in Cuba in the late 1930s, struggling to help her father reunite the family. Okay, so on that note, I'm going to stop and welcome Susan Gladstone to come in so that we can talk about the book.
Okay, I'm trying. Here I am. Okay, thank you so much. Do you want to leave these pictures up? Or, okay.
No, not necessary.
Okay. Well, you've covered a lot about the book in your presentation. So some of my questions you've already answered. But I was very struck by something you wrote about your inspiration for writing the book. So if you don't mind, I'm going to read your words and then ask you to comment on them.
Sure.
So you wrote that Letters from Cuba is your heart's response to the current news of deportations, immigrant travel bans, and the international refugee crisis. And I think what's very interesting about your family story is that your family had to be refugees twice.
Mm-hmm.
So I was wondering if we could start by you commenting on how what's happening in the world today had you write a story about what was happening in the world in 1938.
Yes, thank you so much for that question, because it really is what was going on in my mind. I was very, very concerned about the refugee crisis. I was very hurt and very angry about what was happening, particularly to young people and to children, and those images of children in cages just really were heart-rending to see. And I started thinking about all that. And, you know, we're not talking as much about the refugee crisis now because, of course, we're thinking about the pandemic, but it's still going on. And so I had that very, very much in my mind and kind of wondering, how can I respond to that? And I had wanted to tell this story for a long time, my grandmother's story, and I had mentioned it to my editor, and she said, "Oh, that should be your next book." And I was so glad that she gave me, you know, in a sense, permission to write this story. And so I had that very, very much in my mind. And I started thinking, you know, my family was no different. You know, my family was separated for a long time. In fact, my grandmother was separated from her siblings and her own mother for a long time. She went to Cuba to help her father bring the family. And I thought there's nothing different between that and what immigrants are doing today who are coming from Latin America. And so I wanted to indirectly, in a sense, tell the story so that kids and other readers could have empathy and could have feeling for those who are struggling to come over to this side of the border today. And thinking about my grandmother, and I set the story, later in the late 30s, because that was just before the St. Louis ship, which was turned back in, May, June 1939. But there were these last ships that came into Cuba right before. And so I wanted to set the story in that moment just before. If they'd been later, they wouldn't have gotten in. And so how arbitrary that can be as well. So I had all of that, in my mind, and thinking about, this theme. I mean, that's what makes Cuban Jews so interesting, is that we are, double refugees. We've experienced a double diaspora. Not that other Jews haven't, but our two diasporas came very quickly, one on top of another.
Right.
So the grandparent generation immigrated, and then the parent generation immigrated. So this, double diaspora coming, so quickly. So I wanted to imagine just like what it was like for, someone like my grandmother to arrive in Cuba, a place so different from Poland, and then not just be in Havana. I mean, I show a lot of Jewish Havana in the novel too, but not be in La Habana, but to be in Agramonte, where you're one of two Jewish people, where you and your father are the only Jews that this community has ever seen. And so what is that like? And so I wanted to just imagine all that and put it in the perspective of a child too, how a young person would respond to this.
Right. Well, this leads me to two questions. I'll start with the first one, which is the story does deal with actually having sort of split heritage, two different identifications, and trying to keep those alive through moving from Poland to Cuba and keeping Judaism alive, and then moving from Cuba to the United States and keeping both alive. Could you comment on that?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's interesting how cultures can get layered on top of each other, almost like a lasagna.
Right.
You know. So this layering and yeah, and I'm very, I'm a cultural anthropologist as well as a writer. So I've always been interested in culture and like what is culture and how do people preserve heritage, and that question just really fascinates me. But also, how do people integrate a new culture and a new heritage into their old culture and heritage, which is something, of course, the Jewish people have done, since forever, because we're a people of many diasporas and, we've lived all over the world as a people. So I wanted to kind of experiment with that and imagine it, from a fictional perspective, like, here's this girl Esther, and suddenly she meets people that have these completely different religious practices. They're not even Catholicism or Christianity, which she would have known from Poland, but something completely different. This merging of Catholic and African culture that she experiences in Agramonte, and she wants to understand it. She wants to experiment with it and almost be a part of it. But at the same time, her father is saying to her, be careful. I don't want you going, to those rituals because you're a Jewish girl, and I don't want you to get too involved because eventually we're going to live in the Jewish community in Havana. This is temporary, her father keeps telling her. But she, being young and curious as kids are, she wants to know about this other culture and this other religion, and she wants to experience it. So that's what I kind of try to show how that plays out.
Well, I do have a question about that, but I forgot to say earlier, so let me say it now, that we will be having 15 minutes of questions towards the end of the program. And you can either click the raise your hand button to ask a question yourself live, or you can write your question into the chat and have an email answer sent to you after the program. But I did want to further the conversation about what you were just mentioning, because there is a point in the book where there's a realization that the African community in Cuba and the Jewish community in Cuba have something very much in common. which is the bringing of their cultures with them. Can you comment on that, please?
Yeah, absolutely. No, I thought a lot about that. I think there's a lot of interesting intersections between the two cultures, and that people of African heritage or African descent in Cuba, brought their religious traditions, Yoruba and Arara, and other traditions that came from West and Central Africa. And what's amazing is that they preserved so many of these rituals and songs and liturgy too, because the liturgy is in Yoruba. And they preserved all of this, even through of course, the horrors of slavery in Cuba. And they did it in such an interesting way by creating this convergence of Catholic deities and African or Yoruban deities. So San Lázaro is also Babaluaye, and that was how they kind of created a system where they could hide, their deities under the Catholic, under the image of the Catholic
Mm-hmm.
deity. And so you think about that, and that was like from a spiritual perspective, so amazing how they held on, to that religion and that culture that they brought from
Mm-hmm.
Africa. And I thought, wow, this is so similar to Jews. The Jews do the same thing. They've lived all over the world and continue to live all over the world, and they find ways to both assimilate and to be accepted as Americans or Argentines or
Mm-hmm.
Russians, or, whatever. Jews have been at different points in time, but they still hold on to these Jewish
Mm-hmm.
traditions that that are so ancient, that go
Mm-hmm.
back,
Right.
so much into the past.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's very much true of the Sephardic Jews, your other set of grandparents. Those are some of the things that Jews had to do in Spain and Portugal during the Inquisition, and then wherever they moved to. So
Yeah,
did your two sets of grandparents connect over that aspect at all? Oh, I'm so sorry. That's my...
no worries. I think they did connect over the years,
Mhm.
as the two sides got to know each other. You know, I think at the beginning they seemed very foreign and exotic to one another.
Mhm.
Different customs, Ashkenazi and Sephardic customs are different. For example, Ashkenazi Jews have the custom of naming newborn, babies after a dead relative. You usually say, "Oh, I'll name, the
Mhm.
baby, after a dead grandfather, a dead
Mhm.
grandmother, a great grandparent." But the Sephardic tradition is actually to name the children after living relatives, and typically you name the child after a living grandmother or grandfather. And so that was a conflict. In fact, in our family, when my younger brother, was born, because my father's family wanted him to be named after my grandfather, Isaac or Isaac, and my mother wanted to name him after a dead relative on her
Mhm.
side.
Wow.
So,
Yeah.
so there was a lot of conflict around that. And of course, the foods are different, and
Mhm.
Ladino and Yiddish are different. So I think, it took a number of years for, I think, the two cultures to sort of form
Mhm.
some kind of connection. And I think it's really my mother who has found a way to bridge the two, because she's such a great cook. And so she can cook everything. She can cook the Ashkenazi, the Sephardic dishes, and the Cuban dishes. And I feel that she brought it all together through food, that I grew up
Mhm.
at the foods of all my homes,
Right.
because she could prepare them all.
That's wonderful. We are hoping, by the way, to do a Cuban Jewish food event,
Yes.
so we'll have to invite your mother to
Yeah,
come and help us.
definitely. Definitely.
I want to move on to something else, also, about the story in the book, that is told beautifully through the letters. Richard Blanco, with whom you will be doing a program in August at Books and Books, and I don't mind promoting that, August 26th, you'll be doing a program with him at Books and Books. So he says that your new book touches on themes of family, separation, discrimination, and displacement. But I also think it touches on another subject which I'd like you to address, and that is that this young woman, a girl really in the book, is incredibly brave.
Mm,
She writes to her father and tells her that she's the one who can come and do this. She gets on a ship by herself and sails across the world. I think it's a story of incredible bravery in a young girl, young woman. I
yeah.
think that's another very relevant theme. I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about that, if that was your intention.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Susan. That's amazing. Yes, absolutely. I think that was the core of my grandmother's story. And even if the book is fictional, it's not exactly her story. It's not a
Mhm.
biography, as I said, but the core of it is that courage. The core of it is that courage that I felt that my grandmother had to get on a ship by herself and go to Cuba. This is like before cell phones. How did people, connect?
Mhm.
And she told me this story, and that's why it's there too in the novel. That when you arrived in Cuba at that time as a refugee, they took you to a detention center, essentially called Triscornia. And she told me that that's where they took her, and her father didn't come right away, and she was really nervous. Would he find her? How would he find her? How did he know that he would have
Mhm.
to go find her in this center, in this detention center in Triscornia? And she was very, very afraid and worried. And so I thought, wow, it took huge courage to do
Mhm.
that, to sail across the ocean by
Right.
yourself as a young girl, young woman, not knowing what was ahead,
Mhm.
and to also have begged her father to be the first one
Right.
meant that she thought she was going to be able to really help him bring
Absolutely.
everybody. And that was important.
Mhm. Well, this might be a moment if you're willing to read that letter from the
Oh,
book,
the first letter.
that first letter.
Yeah,
It
I'll be
sets the
glad to.
tone for the entire rest of the book and addresses this theme we were just discussing. So if you wouldn't mind reading that,
No,
it'd
I'd
be
be
great.
glad to. Thank you for
Okay.
asking. Thank you. Govorovo, December 2nd, 1937. Dearest Papa, I am writing to you out of desperation. I pray that my letter arrives safely in your hands so you will listen to my plea. How is it possible we're still separated from you and that 3 years have passed since you left for Cuba? Would you recognize us today, your own family? I could fill a river with my tears when I think of you being so far away. Mama worries we will never see you again. Your papa is gone forever, she says. She scares my brothers and sister with those terrible words, but I promise them we'll be reunited. You will be surprised to learn how much I've grown in the last year. I'm taller than Mama now, which I know isn't saying much. I try to do everything I can to help here. I go to the woods every day and cut balls of juniper for cooking. After school, I work 2 afternoons a week for Yolka, the baker, sweeping ashes and crumbs. He pays me with 2 loaves of rye bread so that for breakfast we have something to dip into the bit of milk our tired cow, Zisela, still gives us. The other children help as much as they can, especially Malka. She reminds me of you because she's smart and studious and never complains. Every morning she warms up the water for Bubby so it won't be too cold when she washes up. Even the twins are old enough to help. You wouldn't even recognize Eliezer and Chaim since they were such babies when you left for Cuba. Today they collected 3 full buckets of berries with Moshe, who they look up to and call Little Papa. This made Mamma smile. She is beautiful when she smiles and her blue eyes sparkle. I'm sad to say not a lot makes Mamma smile anymore. It's getting harder and harder for us here in Poland, especially for me and Moshe and the twins, since we all share your dark hair and eyes. There is no chance we can pass for Polish as Mamma and Malka often can. The Poles always know we are Jews. Some are kind, but some give us nasty looks and spit on the ground as we walk past. Yet I've seen them nod hello to Mamma and Malka as if they are more worthy just because of how they look. Mama is still angry about the loss of our store in Govorovo, and what happened was so unfair. Now that I'm older, I understand that the government overtaxed you and put you out of business just because we are Jewish. You had no choice but to leave Poland to find work and take care of all of us. I don't know what we'd do without the money you send us from Cuba. I've been thinking a lot about all this. According to Jewish tradition, I will be an adult when I turn 12 in a few months. The truth shouldn't be kept from me, which is why I'm upset that Mama tried to hide your letter. She knows how much I miss you, and I am always asking if you've written. I thought we hadn't heard from you in so long because the mail's unreliable these days. But then I found your letter, squirreled inside her shoe. I had gotten suspicious because suddenly we had a little bit of meat to eat with our potatoes, and the money had to come from somewhere. When I read your letter, I understood why Mama hid it. She didn't want me to know that you now have enough savings to bring only one of us to Cuba. Papa, you write that the child who should travel first is Moshe because he's the oldest of the boys, and you think he'll be the most capable of helping you work. But I'm the eldest and stronger than you think. By birthright, it is I who should come. Please, Papa, choose me. Don't think less of me because I am a girl. I will help you show Mama that it wasn't a mistake for you to go to Cuba. I promise if you let me be the one to come first, I will work hard and make you proud. I am eager to see you, dear Papa, and hear your voice. Put your trust in me. I will not disappoint you. Your loving daughter, Esther.
Can't unmute. There we go. Fabulous. I love the letter, and there are other letters I mentioned to you I love as well, but that one really sets the whole tone for everything, all the themes in the book, including her bravery. I want to make sure we have time for questions, so I'm just going to ask you one final quick question, and then we'll turn it over to questions. In your acknowledgments, you thank a number of people who helped you with the writing of the book. But at the very end, you say, Gracias, Cuba. You thank the country. You mentioned that you actually wrote the final chapters while visiting the country, and then you actually have an acknowledgement. So I wonder if you could just kind of quickly address that, and then we'll turn it over for questions.
Yeah, thank you for asking that question. Well, the acknowledgments is that moment when you just kind of go, you want to thank like the world that you were able to write this book. Writing a book is so difficult, and you sit there and you go, how will I ever write this book? How will I ever finish this book? And so, in acknowledgments, you kind of go all out. Writers we all do that. But I wanted to say gracias, Cuba, because Cuba was a sanctuary for my family and for so many other Jews. There was a large community in Cuba. There's still a community in Cuba today. There were about 20,000 Jews, known of, registered Jews in Cuba up until the early 60s, and then many left after the revolution. But they felt overall very welcomed. In Cuba, they really, took up Cuban culture. They, learned to dance the cha-cha-cha. They really became Cuban very, very quickly, the Jews that went to Cuba. And they felt that they were at home there, for many, many years. And I always say to myself that I am Jewish because I am Cuban. If my family had not found refuge in Cuba, we don't know if they would have survived the war and the Holocaust. We just can't say. I think many would have perished as my grandmother's grandmother did. So I wanted to say gracias, Cuba, also because many people know about the St. Louis ship, the 1939 ship where over 900 German Jews were refused entry into Cuba. And so many people think that's Cuba and the Jews. And they don't know that there was this community, that there still is a small community in Cuba of about 1,000 Jewish people, and that is home for these Jews that found Cuba. That island became their home. And so that's why I wanted to say gracias, Cuba, because Cuba gave a home to my 4 grandparents. And thanks to that, they survived. They were able to bring children into the world who survived. And that eventually led to me and, and my family. So I thought, well, I know it seems odd to thank a country, but but I thought, Cuba was our sanctuary.
Yeah, that's wonderful. So we have about 15 minutes left, so I'm going to turn this over to questions. Dr. Morales, you're going to be handling the questions?
Yes, I will. Hello, everyone.
Okay,
please,
I just want to say thank you.
Okay. Of course, thank you everyone for joining us. I'll just be the voice in the screens right now and call out some names. I see some names here already raising their hands. First, we have, I apologize if I'm mispronouncing your name, Ming Shui. I will unmute you so you could ask your question.
Thank you. Thank you, Marty. Thank you, Ruth Behar. I first want to say a big thank you, Professor Behar. I'm an anthropologist at American Museum of Natural History, and I'm also a filmmaker. So your work has been a great inspiration of mine. So I owe you a big thank you. My question is, I haven't read your new book, but I read the introductions of the book that Esther, the girl who wrote the letter, is the lucky one that has been chosen by her father. So she had the privilege to going out of Poland to Cuba and start a new life. And I wonder how you perceive and how you're gonna portray those voices of people who were left behind. Like in your earlier book, Traveling Heavy, there is a chapter called the Freedom of Travel Anywhere in the World. Where you depicted the stories of a family in Cuba that they, you said it probably because of your impacts that they also longing for a lifestyle that they have the freedom to travel anywhere they want. And so I wonder in this new book, how, will there any voices or stories of the people who were left behind and what's their life?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. It's so nice that you came to this event today, that you attended, and I need to get back to you, which I will, about your work, which I'm very excited about. So thank you for that, and thank you for referring the novel to my book of essays, Traveling Heavy. There are all of these interesting family and historical and anthropological connections. And I would say in response to your question that I'm not focusing so much in this particular book on the voices left behind. We do hear from Malka. So Esther is writing these letters to her sister Malka, who's waiting in Poland. And then when Malka arrives, the hope is that they will read the letters together. And so Malka represents, in a sense, a voice left behind, though she does finally come to Cuba. I don't want to give away the whole story, but we learn about Malka's perspective at the end of the novel, and it's different from Esther's. So I just want to say that. So it's not, I think I would need to write another novel, really, that would focus on those left behind in Poland. This novel focuses more on starting over in Cuba, but carrying the weight, just like in Traveling Heavy, carrying the weight of this culture that Esther is bringing with her to a new place. So thank you so much. We'll continue discussing later. Thank you.
If there are any more questions, live questions that you would like to ask Ruth, please raise your hand and I will let you know that I will be unmuting you beforehand. So in the meantime, you could also submit your questions via the chat box, just in case. I know some of us are like a little bit shy about coming on the Zoom live.
Mute. Okay. Are there no other questions at this time? Because
I think for now, the live questions might be a little bit muted. So we'll wait for them to come into the chat. If you'd like to continue chatting, Susan, I know you had a couple more questions left.
Yes. Okay. Well, let me just remind you again that you can get the book, and maybe you want to hold it up, Ruth.
Yes.
You can get the book at Books and Books, and that Ruth will be there in conversation with Richard Blanco on August 26th. So it's just coming out. When is it actually coming out, the book? When will it be available?
It comes out August 25th. So you can pre-order
the day
it.
before.
Yeah, pre-ordering really helps the authors a lot. So if you want to go ahead and pre-order it, if you're getting it on Kindle, it'll show up on your Kindle on August 25th. And then many bookstores actually get the book a few days before the publication date. So the official publication date is August 25th. But if you pre-order, Books and Books might be able to get it for you like exactly that day. You might be able to pick it up, or maybe a few days before. So So that would be great. I really want to support Books and Books. It's such a great independent bookstore in, in the United States and in Miami. So if you can get it from Books and Books, that would be great. But anywhere you'd like to get it, of course, would be wonderful. And there's also going to be an audio book as well by August 25th. So those of you that would rather listen to the story can also listen to it. So we're going to have all of that ready by August 25th.
Okay. So
Ruth and Susan, I actually have a question. Sorry to interrupt you, but they just come into the chat right now. This one is from Mark Platt. He is asking, besides your great-grandmother, Ruth, how many others were left behind in Poland and or left behind in Turkey? And are there any families left in Europe for you? I think that's the question. I'm not sure if I got that right.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So many more who stayed behind in Poland perished. There are these books that are known as Yiskor books for the different shtetls, the different Jewish communities, particularly in Poland, but Lithuania and other places as well. And so there is a Yiskor book for Govorovo that is basically, it's a book about the Jews of Govorovo. And my great-grandfather was actually involved in helping to produce the book for Govorovo. And it has pictures and stories of many of the people that perished in the war or in the Holocaust, before the Holocaust or during the Holocaust. And in addition to my great-grandmother, there's other relatives on my grandmother's side of the family, aunts and uncles and cousins, that are actually in the Yiskor book, and that it says that they perish. So we know that for a fact. And then on my father's side, most of the family, not all the family left Turkey. This is the interesting thing, especially my father's mother. Her family mainly stayed in Turkey. My abuela, she went to Cuba also by herself, and she was sent to Cuba on an arranged marriage. And then when she got to Cuba, the man she was supposed to marry had married someone else. And then eventually she fortunately was able to marry my grandfather. And so she left behind her sisters and her parents in Turkey. And she never saw her parents again, but she did see her sisters much, much later after we were already living in New York, and she also went to Israel, where they eventually settled. So most of the Turkish family, I think all the Turkish families survived, and most of them immigrated to Israel in the 50s. We still have a cousin left in Istanbul from my father's side of the family, and in fact, many years ago in 1992, my husband and I and our son went to Istanbul for his wedding in 92. So there's still that small branch of the family left in Turkey today.
Here, I have more questions here for you, Ruth. I think everybody, the stories got them thinking, and here's some questions about your family. Did all of your family leave Cuba, and do you have family there now? Is it difficult practicing Judaism today in Cuba? And another question about family, how long did it take for the whole family to reunite? And if you don't mind asking this, where did the money come from? I'm curiosity.
Right. Well, we no longer have any family left in Cuba. We have old friends of the family that were practically like family, old neighbors that I reconnected with on my return trips to Cuba. The woman who took care of me as a child, my nanny, was alive until very recently, until 2 years ago. And I would often visit with her and her family. So there were people who actually knew me as a child who are in Cuba, but not family. We had a cousin that I would visit in the 90s. On my father's side of the family, there was a cousin who still lived in Havana, but then he passed away. So he was gone, and he was really the last relative in Cuba. So the others are more friends of the family, very, very close friends, the way in Cuba people form these close friendships that that are almost like family. And so I still have a family in Cuba today that were our neighbors in Havana, and I'm very close to them. Judaism, fortunately, continues to exist in Cuba. There's this small community, as I mentioned, of about 1,000 Jews, and they're very, very dedicated to preserving the traditions, to preserving Shabbat services, preserving the holidays. They get a lot of support from American Jewish organizations like the Joint Distribution Committee and B'nai B'rith and other Jewish organizations, particularly in the United States, have been very helpful, but they also receive aid from the Canadian Jewish Congress and from Latin American Jewish communities, Mexican and Argentine and Panamanian in particular, and all of that helps to keep the community alive in Cuba. And it's always very moving for me when I'm in Cuba and I go to Shabbat services and think about how every person who goes to a Shabbat service in Cuba really counts because there's so few people. So when you go, you're really helping to maintain the Jewish tradition on the island of Cuba. The synagogues are still there, the Jewish cemeteries. There's a lot left in the very landscape of Cuba that's Jewish, and that is very, very amazing to see when you go to Cuba. The family was reunited over time. In my book, it happens much more quickly than it happened in real life because my book is fiction, it's dramatic, but it took several years to reunite my grandmother's family. Definitely it wasn't an easy thing to do. They worked very hard, they saved money, they sacrificed exactly what immigrants do today. They just work really hard and live on as little as they can and just put the money aside. And that's very much what my family did. Most of the Jews that went to Cuba, particularly the men, worked as peddlers, and they were selling shmates, as we say in Yiddish. They were selling all kinds of Jewish, fabric and rags and so on, the Jewish shmate trade, as it's called. So many worked selling fabric. That was extremely common among the Jewish community, but there were, of course, other jobs as well that people had, and they saved as much money as they could to bring the family over. I hope that answers the questions.
I think so. It's amazing how you were able to remember all those questions. I have one more question here, and it's, why do you think that the 1,000 or so Jews did not leave for Miami? I think that's a very interesting question.
That's a fascinating question, and I've thought a lot about that. Many have left. So the community really revitalized in the early 90s because in the 60s and 70s and 80s, religion pretty much went underground in Cuba because they were trying to enforce atheism on the population as they were creating a communist, revolution. So they didn't want people to be religious at all. And so many Jewish people, held on to the beliefs but didn't go to synagogue, except for the older people continued to go and, and held on to a lot of the traditions. And there were many Jewish people that married out of the Jewish community. And so what's interesting is, in the 50s, it was, really looked down upon in the Jewish community to marry outside of the Jewish community. That was viewed as an intermarriage, a true intermarriage. And it was not something that was well viewed in the community. So many Jews who married outside of the Jewish community essentially left the Jewish community and became more part of Cuba. And so what's so interesting is that many of the Jews in Cuba today are children, grandchildren, or sometimes great-grandchildren of these people that married out of the community in the 1950s, and they've reconnected with their Jewish heritage, kind of the way Susan was talking about crypto Jews, or Jews that held on to their beliefs or some of their beliefs even while converting to Catholicism. And so that's what has happened with the community. There are many people that are that are Jewish on one side of the family, but they've reconnected with their culture, with their heritage. They want to be part of the Jewish community. And so the majority of those 1,000 Jews are mixed. They're mixed, but they're fully Jewish. There are many who have converted to Judaism because they married somebody of Jewish heritage and they want to enter the community. And so there's that interesting mixture in the community. There are about maybe a dozen people left in Cuba who are Jewish, both on the mother's and father's side, but not that many. And so that's the community. It's a community of people that still feel very connected to Cuba. They don't want to start again as immigrants. And yet at the same time, they fervently hold on to their Jewish heritage.
Well, it seems that we've run out of time. And unfortunately, we cannot get to any more questions. I know we had a raised hand, so please do email us any questions you might have. Everyone on this Zoom, we will send you a copy of the recording. I'm sure this is one of those that you want to listen over and over again, just having Ruth read to us. Thank you so much,
Thank you
Ruth.
so much.
Thank you. Thanks to all of you.
Thank you, Ruth. It was a
Thank
pleasure.
you, Susan. Thank you, Maite.
Thank you to everyone.
Carla. Thank you to everybody for being here today. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Goodbye, everyone.
Bye-bye.